Okay, guys, welcome, and I'm excited to be here and talk to you guys about autistic burnout, what it is and how we can try to prevent it. We're going to jump right in to I hope you will learn today about the autistic burnout characteristics and causes. Masking is very much related to autistic burnout, so the high cost of masking, mental health outcomes in autistic adults, which some of you may already be familiar with some of the depressing statistics. I'm not sharing those to depress you. I'm sharing them because they're important things for us to be working on. Preferred mental health interventions for autistic adults, and tangible inclusion strategies for improving quality of life and hopefully preventing the autistic burnout. And we can all, there's very tangible things that we can all have a hand in helping in society. So we'll get started with what is autistic burnout. So the research on autistic burnout is something distinct from general burnout, is relatively new. There's not much research on this specifically, but there's one paper in particular that I really enjoyed reading, and they defined it with help from, the autism community as a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic life stress and a mismatch of expectations and abilities without adequate supports. It's characterized by pervasive, long-term, and for sure, typically 3+ months, exhaustion, loss of function, and reduced tolerance to stimulus. I don't usually like to read like the clinical definitions, but I really think this captures it, and we are going to unpack a lot of this, and so we can make sense of like, what does this really mean? A lot of autistic voices went into creating that definition. So characteristics of autistic burnout we saw in the last slide. Chronic exhaustion is not like, oh, it's the weekend and I'm so tired, I'm exhausted. We say we're exhausted all the time, and sometimes we are and sometimes we're not. But this is more like if you've ever seen somebody with severe depression and it's just feels almost impossible to even move, like you just want to lay in bed and you can't even barely bring yourself to get out of bed or take the covers off even. So this is, and it's over a long period of time. So that's what we mean by chronic exhaustion. Loss of skills, we used to call this loss of function. It's not necessarily like skills like you would think of in a workplace. I mean, really basic stuff that maybe some of us struggled really hard to learn growing up, in terms of like, the life skills, activities of daily living, tying our shoes and brushing our teeth and remembering to do the hygiene things that we just can't manage to do anymore. And it does look a little bit different for different people. And reduced tolerance to stimuli. I would compare this usually to, I don't know if anyone else here has trouble with really bad migraines sometimes or knows somebody who does. That feeling where if any little bit of light or motion is just going to make you sick. So like, I know reduced tolerance to stimuli is I like to point out that, if somebody could look at this and say like, well, Katie, that sounds like you on any day. So reduced tolerance to stimuli, you're looking for a change. Like if you know that person and, they're already sensitive to something, but they're suddenly, or becoming much, much more sensitive to it. Causes of autistic burnout, again, remind that these are being identified by autistic people that were surveyed for a research paper. So life stressors, I laid this out in this way because it kind of all builds on itself. So there's the life stressors. The most commonly identified life stressor is masking, and we'll unpack that in a little bit more detail, leading to cumulative overwhelm and stress combined with barriers to support. And the most common barrier to support was identified as a lack of empathy and dismissal of struggles. I call this gaslighting, but it can take other forms as well. So it means that we can't often get the help that we need. And what happens is eventually expectations on us outweigh our abilities to perform until we kind of just collapse under the pressure. So what else did I want to say about this? I just want to highlight the mismatch in expectations and abilities. And I think I have this throughout the presentation in talking about how we are sometimes viewed as lazy. And so I won't go into too much detail on that now. But let me just go back and we'll just go through this just really quickly because I said a lot of words, but basically it kind of works like life stressors such as masking and other life stressors build cumulative overwhelm and stress. And because there's barriers to support, we're not able to get the help we need. And eventually the expectations outweigh our abilities until we collapse. And I like this, and you'll see like when I show my example from my personal life, when I read this paper and saw this, I'm like, well, that maps out my experience exactly. So additional causes I wanted to include that didn't fit well, just to kind of reiterate some of the points. That I really want to focus on lack of acceptance and inclusion in society as one of the things that contributes to negative mental health outcomes caused at least in large part by masking and autistic burnout. Those are things that we can all be working on, whether or not we know a specific person with autism, but I'm guessing many of you do. The access to mental health supports that are lacking. I hear that from the folks in my meetup group a lot. Like, does anybody know a good therapist that understands autism? And I have a handful of folks that I refer to, but there's a lot more people who need mental health support than can find the appropriate care that they need. And then again, what I call gaslighting, the lack of empathy, misunderstanding, and dismissal of our challenges. There is a big demand for autistic providers of these services and actual medical doctor services as well. I think I have that on another slide coming up as well. So let's dig a little bit deeper into masking. So when I'm talking with folks, I hear a lot, well, everybody masks. We do that at work, we do that in various parts of our life. Yes, that's true. Everybody does mask at certain parts of their life. But I think it's a little bit different. I say it's like a little bit extra or a lot extra for some people with autism. So when we're masking, it's usually to mask our identity in an attempt to avoid stigma. And I've heard people talk about it as like being able to survive in environments where we're just really suffering from severe overwhelm. It feels like you're just barely hanging on. And this can come in, it can be many things. It can come in many forms. This is certainly not an exhaustive list of what masking is or means to people. But it often feels like resisting or holding in natural responses to emotional experiences. For us, some of us, that might mean flapping our hands, rocking. This is how we are, so some of our natural responses to the world around us. And when we're forced to hold those in, all that energy kind of, an emotion builds up inside and has no kind of escape valve. So observing, memorizing, mimicking, and acting out social scripts. Sure, everybody does that to some extent when we get like a new job, when we're in certain business settings, networking events. We try to mimic what's going on around us, but for most people, it's not 24/7, but I think most people have done this to some extent. So you can kind of imagine what that would be like. Think about like when you're at a networking event and you maybe feel a little bit out of your element. You don't know a lot of people, and that kind of mimicking and social scripting that you might do, having to do that to like 24/7, because there are some folks who do feel the need to mask still at home. Participating in activities and conversations that aren't of interest. Again, all of us have to do this. It's just the sheer volume of it that sometimes people on the autism spectrum have to do. Resisting our own needs and preferences. Nobody should have to do that all of the time. Ideally, we wouldn't have to do it at all, but sometimes people have to, but it's just the volume and the frequency with which we have to do it. And that that feeling of needing to try to control everything, so we don't lose track of what's going on around us and start messing up our scripts. So that's a lot to process. So let me pause and make sure that I'm not skipping anything that I did want to say about that aside from what's on the slide itself. So I've talked about, knowing that you can usually drop the mask a little bit after you get used to a new situation and eventually be yourself. For a lot of autistic people, we feel like we can't do this. I really hardly ever mask anymore, but there are situations that I do. But for some people, they do this on and on into adulthood, and it's not sustainable. So there is a cost to masking, and this would be true, I think. I don't think this is unique to autistic people. I think that there would be this cost of masking for anyone who had to do this to this extent. Higher rates of depression and anxiety, more frequent PTSD, shorter average lifespan. These are the things where I had to give the qualifier that I'm not saying these things to depress us. I feel really happy about my life, and I know a lot of other autistic people who do as well. The shorter average lifespan is related to a lot of other aspects. And there's a lot of the research that I looked at came up with age 36. I've seen other stuff as high as 54 years. And of course, we know there's a lot more than just the anxiety and the higher suicide rate that goes into this, other health challenges and, self-harm things that happen. So the more frequent suicidal ideation and higher rates of suicide, I think these are things that we can change. I want us to feel hopeful about this, but I want us to understand why, some of the reasons why this is happening. The misdiagnosis when you're masking, like, people are going to miss what's going on with you. That happened to me growing up, and we'll see in my story. But all of these things are related to and can lead to autistic burnout. Let's move on. I've been doing my peer support group for over 3 years now, and all the stuff that I'm reading in the paper, the research papers and the articles from other folks with autism, I'm hearing all of these same things echoed in my group. The intense anxiety is a thread that goes through for almost everybody. Depression and feelings of hopelessness, feeling misunderstood if you're in a situation where you have to kind of mask who you are and mimic people around you all the time. It's easy to see why you would feel misunderstood and maybe hopeless. I hear a lot of talk of PTSD, and we have people who come to group and talk about their suicidal ideation and even attempts that they've made in the past. So these things are very real, but I think that I feel hopeful about change, and I hope that you all will too by the end of my presentation. So I'm going to pause here, in part to get some coffee, also to see if there's any questions. I don't know if you guys also use, I recommend the use of Fidgets for everybody. I was in a meeting this morning where one of my colleagues' daughters came into the call because I had this. And I was showing, I'm like, this is what's always going on, something like this below the video line. And she said, oh my God, that's a really cool fidget. So anyway, I recommend using Fidgets for everybody. They can really help you manage your anxiety, and they're fun. I have some kind of more rigid ones here, but there's really soft, squishy ones as well. So I see something in the chat. Using Fidgets all the time. Right on. They're very cool. There's some really sleek ones. There's what is this young autistic boy's name? He's 15 or 16. His first name's Kai. Kaiko Fidgets is his company. He has developed a company where he's got these sleek, awesome looking kind of like stainless steel, I'm not sure what material they are, fidgets, because he was tired of getting picked on for having these things that looked like kind of childish. Like, I don't care anymore because I'm 42, but he was in middle school and he was getting picked on for having stuff like this. So he has a very cool company with some very sleek looking fidgets if anyone wants to check out Kaiko Fidgets. Okay, just a little bit of water and then we'll move on. So I'm going to share my story with you guys. And I started with and mapped it out kind of from early on because it kind of follows that trajectory of that building stress and like that cumulative ongoing, you know, I could feel it ramping up through the years. I didn't know what it was then, of course, but like looking back on it with hindsight, I can see that these things were happening. So yeah, preschool was like, the beginning of the end, where I wasn't able to just stay at home in my cocoon anymore. So I didn't really like being away from home and away from my mom. I stood in a corner and, you know, which I would be described probably as socially awkward. So the preschool wanted to put me in special education, which back then, this was in the 80s. So usually meant that they thought you weren't as smart as the rest of the students. It can mean a variety of different things now. But my parents had me IQ tested and they put me in the gifted program. So I liked that program. I liked the schoolwork, but I just hated being at school all day long. It was just way too much stimulation. Still is. I had a same problem with working a regular 9-to-5 job. That's too much stimulation with not enough breaks for me to be able to function. And so, you know, back then, even in elementary, I needed what we would now call accommodations. Nobody in my family had ever heard of accommodations back then, or would even think that it was okay to ask for them. So, you know, I look back now, I'm like when I was faking sick and saying I needed to stay home, even though I wasn't physically ill, I kind of view that now as a type of sick because I was feeling so overwhelmed that I couldn't function, but I didn't know how to communicate that to anybody. Even my mom, who was very, very supportive of me. So I was already struggling with severe anxiety in elementary school, but there were a lot of high hopes because I was such a gifted student. And so middle school, like for everybody, was a very rough transition. I went from, back then they did the gifted program as you go through, at least at my school, we went through the same class with the same people, exact same students. And we really didn't mix and socialize with everybody else either. We were kind of segregated. I know that's not the way we do things today. I did see pros and cons to that, but that's a completely different story. So going to 6th grade, where it was combined with the middle school and high school, I was in with completely different students that I didn't know. That's overwhelming for any kid, right? So I was able to make a small group of close friends, which I feel very grateful for. We were kind of you know, the misfits group. A lot of autistic adults I talked to didn't have that, and so I do feel very grateful for that. However, it didn't prevent some of the emotional struggles that I started having. My grades did plummet, in part because, well, mostly because, well, I guess I say I wasn't trying, but I think I couldn't, I was trying and it wasn't working. Yeah, so the depression and anxiety started. Let me make sure that I'm not missing any important points in my notes that I wanted to cover. Yeah, so yeah, I was having panic attacks and having to go to the counselor a lot. And it was just really difficult, I think, even for my friends to be around me because I was so negative and just really down on life and couldn't find any, you know, redeeming value in life. But I wouldn't say that I was suicidal. I don't think that I was really suicidal at any point, but I didn't value my life necessarily. So in high school, I started drinking and smoking, which took the edge off quite a bit. This is not a good coping strategy, of course. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the substance abuse. I was able to work through this, although I did at a relatively early age use drinking to be able to kind of cope, and not necessarily always in a social way. You will talk to autistic adults on occasion that will openly talk about, yes, I do substance abuse. I use these things because they help me. I understand that I might die from this, and I'm okay with that because it's the only way that I can socialize. So that's not uncommon in our community. So I continued struggling through high school. I started self-harming, cutting myself, and people ask me a lot of times, why did you do that? And honestly, I still don't know how to answer. I don't know why that made me feel better, but at the time it did. And it sent me to a lot of therapists, a lot of medications, but nobody diagnosed me with autism. And my symptoms began to, keep getting worse. Let's see. Okay, so this was the point yes, my mother went to the principal. I was with her. She went to the principal and talked of my struggles and how everything was too much for me. And I saw my mom break down in tears in front of the principal, and they went to the school board and got my schedule reduced. So this was like the version of an accommodation that I got. There wasn't a lot of understanding about it, but they did accommodate the situation, and it did help. I had a reduced schedule where I went to half a day. I was still able to graduate. I went to school till lunchtime, and then I came home and did my work from home. And unlike my junior year, I was really starting to skip and not go because it was too much for me. So the accommodation of reduced schedule did really help. But it was a little bit too late to prevent the burnout. And I'll come back to this point a little bit, but that's the kind of accommodation that if they could have given that to me much earlier on, I could have potentially, it's impossible to say for sure, of course, but could have gone a lot easier for me, I think. So this is where I became a community college dropout. So I just barely scratched through high school. And nobody understood because, I had done so well in school and elementary. I started an associate's degree in broadcasting because it was the closest thing I could find to. I wanted to go into music production and maybe work for a recording studio. I've since gone back and picked up those skills on my own just for hobby. But I switched majors. I don't even remember what I was in. I think my dad talked me into banking at some point, but I didn't even really care what it was. And so I just was really struggling, and I dropped out. So it looked to others, this was when I was 19. So it looked to others like I was just lazy. But inside, that's not how I felt. Like I really did want to contribute. I had interests that I wanted to be doing, and I didn't understand what was happening to me. So there were times, like I mentioned before, that it's just like you can't even get out of bed. My hygiene was suffering. I didn't find any joy in any old interests or hobbies, and really wasn't able to start anything. I did get a fast food job that I was able to keep through a lot of this. And I worked late nights, which I stayed up all night playing solitaire and watching TV. So I wasn't really interacting with anybody outside of work. So yeah, everybody thought I was lazy, and I didn't feel lazy, and I didn't understand what was happening to me. I was doing the best that I could, and sometimes the best that I could do was I got out of bed and brushed my teeth, and that was like my big success for the day. So it took me about 4 years to work through this. I did keep the fast food job. I was just commenting to somebody today how there are actually some times that I miss being able to just go into a job and put the meat in the taco, put the meat in the taco, put the meat in the taco. And then you go home and there's a clear, there's a clear separation, and that kind of routine Although that was a very, very overwhelming job in a lot of ways, I will say. There's some things that I kind of miss about it. So I was 19 when I quit going to college. You might say I flunked out. That's probably true. And I went back when I was 23 to the same community college. And I started taking one class at a time in math. And I'm like, there's no way I'm going to be able to do this. I don't know why I'm doing this. But my dad's like, why don't you just go and try? And I don't know why. I don't know what happened that got me the motivation. I can't really put my finger on it, but I talked myself into it, and I liked it. I remembered that when I was little, I loved math, and I took one class at a time, and it was what I could handle. I eventually got my grade point average up high enough to transfer to Michigan State University as a sophomore, where I did major in statistics. So I want to point out, though, that in the same way that it would have been helpful to have the right diagnosis, so I know what I needed, it also would have been helpful if I would have known that what I was experiencing was autistic burnout, and I wasn't just a loser, which is, I think, what a lot of us think when we're going through this. Because whether people say that right to our face or not, we feel those kind of judgments from people. And it might have helped me to develop a strategy rather than just what I did, which was wait it out, which took 4 years. And this is my favorite slide, my post-burnout accomplishments. There is light at the end of the tunnel. I went to Michigan State and I did a statistics major, second major in Russian, actuarial science specialization. And I was taking, believe it or not, at the last 2 semesters at Michigan State, each semester I had 22 credits, in the last semester 23 credits, and made the dean's list. I did 3 study abroad programs and was in the actuarial science club, and student advisory council was just the last year I did that. Went on to get my master's in applied economics and statistics from Clemson, and served 2 years in Uganda as an economic development specialist for the Peace Corps. I didn't put this one on. I think I just ran out of room, but I have to say too that I did my bucket list goal of going to all 7 continents. I did 18 countries. One of my study abroad programs was in Antarctica. So I'm like, well, now that I've checked that one off the list, I have to do all 7. So it took me longer than just my school years, but I did do that. So I was able to accomplish all these things. Despite all those struggles, I'm not saying these things, of course, to brag, although I am quite proud of my accomplishments and very proud of those. But I say these things, I like to share these things because I want others to know that it is possible. And I want everybody to understand why it's important to support autistic kids and adults in ways that work for them. And it's hard to not, we do feel the judgment sometimes. And I think it's not always coming from words. And I'm sure that I'm guilty of doing this to people sometimes as well. So I want to just ask us all, including myself, to be more mindful of how we're viewing people, because we can sometimes feel, a little bit of judgment that like we're just maybe a little bit lazy and not trying hard enough. So most important part on that is believe us when we say we're struggling. Believe us when we say we need something. If I had had the right supports, it probably would have been not as rocky a journey to get to all these accomplishments that I've been able to do. I also, it's important to point out that it might have taken me still as long. There's a different way to kind of look at things. We have ideas in our culture that this thing has to be done at this point, this has to be done at that point, and you're not moving fast enough. If I hadn't had that burnout, I still might not have graduated college until I was almost 30, because I would have been maybe pacing myself in a way that worked for me. But I would have had a much better quality of life, presumably, throughout. So it looks like we maybe have, let me see. Okay, I'll do this one and then we'll take questions. It looks like we do have some questions or comments. Just remember, this is a takeaway if you can, or I'll share the slides, that all autistic people deserve the opportunity to live their life in a way that works for them, to set their own goals, and to define and achieve success in a way that works for them. What I was talking about before is defining success in a way that works for me. Might be a slower pace, but it would have been better for me. So let's see. We have in the chat. You're welcome, Jennifer. And thank you, Kara. If that wow was for me.
Yeah, it was when you were sharing all your accomplishments, and I definitely learned more about you when you disclosed all that.
Yeah, no, I like sharing my story, and hopes that it can inspire and inspire people to live a better life and inspire change for allies too. This will be another whole, I do see hands up. I have a lot of ideas for programming for Full Spectrum, which is my organization, and hopefully working with Autism Alliance and the concept of allyship. So yeah, inspiring folks to do what we can in realistic ways that can help the autistic community. Kim, do you have a question?
Yeah. First off, thank you for sharing. This was actually really, really enjoyable.
And also, I still have, sorry to interrupt, but I do still have some tips that I'm going to share with you guys.
Oh,
so
cool.
There's more.
Okay.
But wait, there's more. But go ahead with your question.
Yeah, so I just had one question about, I know earlier you mentioned you were familiar with therapists who were familiar with working with individuals with autism. Is it possible if you can share those resources whenever you get a chance? Because I have a lot of families who ask about that.
Yeah, and I think they're all, I have talked to them all and got them in the Navigator, but I'm happy to even like share, I can share those resources. I often do, what I do want to make sure that I do is I make sure I get everybody who's on the DEI committee kind of in my, I call it my email list. When I find a really great resource that I want to share with folks at Autism Alliance, I sometimes just send that email out, and I know I send it to the entire Navigator team.
Awesome. Yep.
So you're probably getting a lot of those. But I will put a note on my to-do list to make sure I send an email with those 3 therapist names and contact information.
Thank you, Katie.
You're welcome. They are in the Navigator, but just to bring them to front of mind, I'll send that out to everybody as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Also, go green, go white. I know you mentioned
yeah. I know there's some fellow Sparties in the audience. Oh, we've got some people that came in too that I was just flipping through the videos that I didn't see come in earlier. Hi, Shanta. And anyone else who has joined us that I didn't get to greet. Jill, hello. So if there's no other, let me check the chat one more time. Oh yeah, so go green, go white. Let's see. I always lose track of how to advance the slides. And one thing I haven't done so far that I often do when I'm presenting is somehow draw little scribbly like colored lines all over everything. I still don't know how I do it, but we'll see if we get any fun. My peer support group calls them Katie Doodles. We'll see if we get any Katie Doodles before the end. So interventions and strategies. Give me 1 minute to get a drink of water. And this again is of course not an exhaustive list of things, and hope that this is just the beginning of the conversation, honestly. So I'm always open to hearing other ideas and of what you guys ideas you guys have. Sorry, I was thrown off for a minute by the order of my slides. So preferred interventions that were identified in the research. I think that I have this in the wrong place, but it's still good information. Autistic adults had identified like wanting peer-led support groups, meditation and exercise as forms of intervention, trauma-informed care, art therapy, animal-assisted therapy, and there is a strong preference for the interventions to be peer-led. Personally, I've had a lot of care from neurotypicals, and if I find the right one, it does work, but there's a lot of trauma in our community of like people, the way people feel they've been either have been treated or feel they've been wrongly treated by people in society. And so for some, there's a strong preference for going to like a therapist or a doctor. I really like the idea. This is again like probably another whole presentation, the idea of having a database of autistic professionals. So identifying those folks that we need to be in that database is going to be a huge task, but we do a little bit at a time and eventually we get there. Okay, so some of the things that we're going to talk about now are society interventions, and these are the things that anybody can do. So there's the reducing the stigma, which is a really broad thing, but there's lots of little ways that we can do that. Education of society about autism, and specifically the lived experience of autism. I think that we can all, if we, a little bit at a time, like learn what we can, including me. I learn a lot from my meetup group because we all experience autism different. And educate, like tell somebody everything you like, take something you learned today in this presentation and tell somebody else about it. Tell somebody that. That's how we make progress. So I think really ultimately the best way to prevent a lot of these things happening is on the societal level with true acceptance and inclusion of autistic people. And these are things that everybody can be working on. So let's look at some of these specific examples. And here's where I have a lot of notes that I might kind of just rush through and not cover all my notes because we want time for questions. But accessible spaces and environments, fragrance-free. I have a colleague who really struggles, an autistic colleague with fragrances, and we were in a space once that claimed to be fragrance-free, and they had a board meeting in the room next to us, and all of the ladies, maybe not all of them, I don't really know that for sure, a lot of the ladies were wearing perfumes, and he had to leave the building. So that doesn't make things inclusive. So that's hard to enforce, but we do need to be able to speak up. I'm very adamant about, like, if you say you're fragrance free, you have to actually be fragrance free. Sensory friendly can mean so many things. And so I always encourage just to ask people what they need, but make sure that it's communicated clearly that it's okay to ask, for a change in the environment. Sometimes people are so afraid to ask. Like when I was growing up and me and my parents just didn't know that it was, we would never ask for what we call now an accommodation. We just didn't think that was appropriate to ask. And so making environments where people know that it's okay to ask for something and asking outright, what do you need? Is there anything that you need to be different? Frequent breaks and between activities, and especially during long activities, and making sure people know it's okay to do that, that they don't have to ask for permission if you do get into a situation. And these are, I often think about the workplace when I think about these, but these are true at home as well. They're true in education settings, in any setting really. If you get to a point where people are taking too many breaks and it's like, it's affecting things in a way, just work one-on-one with that person to come to almost 100% of the time you come up with a solution. Limited number of activities and events is very much related to the frequent breaks. Just by taking frequent breaks, you're going to be limited in how many activities and events you do. I structure this right into my life now as an adult. For children, it might be like, some of you might be familiar with, like, there's an activity or something that the kid really, really doesn't want to do. And this can be for any kid. you might sit them down and talk about why it's important to do the activity, how long it'll take, what to expect, and then, you know, kind of buffer that with like, before we go to the activity, you can do, you know, such and such preferred activity for this amount of time. And when you get back, I won't make you do anything else that you don't want to do for such and such an amount of time. You can do a preferred activity. I do that with myself all day. I do it multiple times per day. So when you're a kid, you need to ask permission, but that's a good way to support people in our lives. And having a quiet recovery room, or some people call it a sensory room, having a quiet room I can go to when I'm in a public place. Sometimes just knowing that it's available in itself reduces the chances that I'll actually need it. So knowing that I will be able to kind of like escape, because I do get really ramped up anxiety when I feel like I can't escape a social situation where there's a lot of people around. So accessible spaces. I'm going to check the chat just really quick. We're talking about the we're having a college rivalries in the chat. Accessible communication, incorporating different communication methods. I have some important notes on this actually, so I'm going to pull these up. I really want to focus on people who are non-speaking. So there's different ways that you can make communication accessible, whether it's sign language, AAC devices, writing, drawing. Sign language doesn't mean that everyone has to know sign language. I mean, that would be nice if we all did. I don't. I've always said I wanted to learn it and I haven't yet, but you know, having somebody on, if you have people who use sign language, having somebody on who can assist with that. AAC devices. I've been to a couple conferences lately, guys, where non-speaking people were presenters, and it was awesome. And I will share that in the email. There might be a video that I can share. I believe that non-speaking people have been given the message very strongly that we don't have the time to listen to your voice, and like that's really just not okay. It takes a little bit longer. We have to wait for people to type and for their thing to say the words. I was leading something once where a woman was there with her adult son, and I was interacting. I was looking at the son because that's who I was talking to. And the mother said, I speak for him. And I hear this a lot. And if she does really speak for him, what I don't understand is he must have a way of communicating with her, right? Otherwise, she's not really speaking for him. She's saying what she thinks he wants to say. I'm assuming there's a way that he's communicating with her. And if that's true, what we need to do is help people so that they're able to communicate that way with everybody. And that requires a lot of patience on a lot of people's part. And I was willing to be patient, but because I don't fault that mother for that, because I think what she was responding to is a lifetime of society telling her that it was not okay for her son to communicate that way, that we don't have the time for you. Those are the kind of things we need to really change. Text chat, you can participate. Autistic people can come to our meetups and have their volume off, have their speakers off the entire time. We have done the closed captions for people who have triggers with sounds like misophonia. They get triggered by certain voices. You can participate the entire time with your speakers and your microphone completely off and still be included. So you've got to make these accommodations for folks to be included and not just in like events, but in society. Yeah, providing space and materials for people, different ways of communicating, extra time. I've covered most of this. Even people who are speaking people, leaving those silences for them to organize their thoughts. That's hard for me to do, even sometimes as a facilitator, remembering to leave those those silences that can feel a little bit awkward, but are necessary. Written agendas. I had a colleague who got this as an accommodation, quote unquote, in her workplace, and the agenda So her boss said, well, write up the agenda then for the meeting. So she wrote up the agenda. She said, do you have anything to add to this agenda? He said, no, I don't have anything for the agenda. And so she gets to the meeting, and the supervisor just goes off on a completely other thing and doesn't. So that's not an accommodation, right? Because he's just checking a box so he doesn't get in trouble for not following EDA. So we have to look out for people doing stuff like this, and hopefully, sometimes we can speak up. Sometimes it might not feel as safe to speak up. It depends on the circumstances and the context. She got a different job, and I haven't heard about how it's going yet, but I'm excited for her. This is my favorite one. I might say that multiple times, but right now it's my favorite one. Educate yourself about the lived experience of autism. There's so many blogs and books, and I know it's difficult to, you look at this and say like, oh man, I really want to I'll have a list of cool stuff for you guys to check out, and you get excited and really want to check it out. And there's limited time sometimes for this. There's really some great people on YouTube and other social media. Just if you can make time once in a while for something little, you don't have to spend hours on this. If you can find some downtime here and there too. And it doesn't have to be these things either. It can be talking to people, you all know me. You can reach out to me. I'm hoping to have some other programs in the future, hopefully this year. The allyship stuff that I mentioned earlier, that we're hopefully very deliberately interacting with neurotypical and neurodivergent people. The more you talk to people, the more you will learn. Establish and honor boundaries. We have different needs than most. If someone says they need a break, believe them. And don't make them feel like there's going to be a punishment, because then they won't ask for help, of course. Not making people feel bad about not wanting to shake hands and make eye contact. Those things really don't matter that much. I see this already changing in our society. So I think I will see the day where I don't have to say this to people anymore, right? And everybody's boundaries are different. So we just have to trust the individual. Ableism. I think I am going to leave a little bit of time for questions. I could do multiple presentations just on ableism. It's when there's prejudice against people with disabilities, or who perceived to be disabled. So it can be, I've got 3 examples here, all that I've either experienced or my friends have experienced. Assumption that everyone is able to work in an open office setting without getting overwhelmed, and then providing no alternative to that. Wearing perfume in a fragrance-free environment, and prioritizing the voice of speaking individuals over non-speaking individuals are all good examples of ableism. So remember this one too. You might not be able to recognize, you might not be going through your life and saying, oh, that's ableism, but question everything, question the status quo, because just because this XYZ thing works for the majority of people doesn't mean that it works for everybody. So if you're not seeing glaring examples of ableism, look around and take some time each day to question what's going on around you, question the status quo, and you'll be able to start recognizing some of those things that are happening, and finding opportunities to speak up in a nice way, of course. So let me look if there's anything in the chat. I will probably share these. I'm going to kind of breeze through this. I'll probably just share. I've already shared the slides with Kara, so I think we can just share this. But there's some great blogs. There's some authors that you should read. There's Sincerely Your Autistic Child with multiple authors. We'll also give you an idea of others you can follow online. Some of these people, I've been on their podcast. They're great people. And here's my contact information and information about Full Spectrum Agency. I'm going to stop sharing, and so I can see everybody's faces if they have their videos on. But I will post, I'll post this content in the, in the chat if I can remember to. Whew. Okay. Hello, everybody. Hey, Kyle. This is some new faces that joined. What are your questions, guys, or comments or suggestions for other ways we can work on this that I haven't mentioned already? Informative and helpful. Thank you, Brittany. I'm so glad. Kara.
So my question, from obviously you explaining autistic burnout, to me, it presents probably a lot as depression. So how does that, how would you, in the 4 years of you kind of working through that, like, did you go to a therapist at the time? Like how did it lead you to an evaluation as well?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I can actually talk for, that might even be a slide I could add for when I do this in the future, because that's an excellent question. So I was being treated for severe depression. I was being treated for generalized anxiety disorder. I was at one point diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. So it can look like so many different things. I was being heavily medicated at one point with some really severe side effects, and nothing was working. So it was a lot of trial and error. I think that people, we're doing a little bit better job of it now. That's really tough to answer because it depends so much on the patient being an advocate for themselves. And when you don't understand what's going on, and especially when you're young, that's really, really difficult to do. So I think the best thing that, I might be losing track of your original question, but the best thing to do is for the parent and the friends and the family who know the person best it goes back to that trust and believing what they say and really understanding that person. And so you might have to be an advocate for somebody that you love so that they get the appropriate treatment, because for me, it was a really, really long road. With some of the treatment that I got was helpful, but was still the wrong diagnosis. So I didn't get I had come through completely my my burnout, or at least that burnout. There's been some smaller ones here and there since then, just by waiting it out. And we can do so much better job of supporting people through that. I'm not sure if I've gotten at the heart of your question, Kara. If I haven't, you can repeat what was your question.
No, that was really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, good. Jill. Oh, hey, Jill. I don't know if I said hello to you.
No, I jumped on a little late. Thank you so much. This was, as always, so amazing. I'm always, I could listen to you forever talk.
I could talk forever
after every interaction. But no, this isn't really so much a question, just kind of a add-on to what Kara was talking about, because I guess I'm sort of looking at things from a clinical lens, just because of my background. And I was very much thinking the same thing Kara was as well. And I guess one thing just that I would share that I see quite frequently is, especially for kids who are sort of kind of skating just below that threshold of getting a diagnosis. Yeah. And they're the ones that I kind of worry about the most because it's not so obvious and evident. But more often than not, I see exactly what you were describing in terms of, I guess I would just encourage people to even maybe talk to the individual or talk to parents themselves to take a step back and look at the whole picture, because it's not uncommon for me to have kids come into clinic and they have a diagnosis of OCD, they have a diagnosis of anxiety, they have a diagnosis of depression, they have a diagnosis of social communication disorder, they have a diagnosis of ADHD. And
it's
nobody
all over the place.
Steps back and looks at the whole picture and says, okay, could this person potentially have autism? And and I see that so frequently, it kind of gets missed. And so I think that would just be my one suggestion, is to kind of step back. And I think for many of you I know who have heard me talk about, when I do sort of talks clinically and I talk about all of those medical and mental health comorbidities, I think that's one of the reasons why I stress that so much, because a lot of times those diagnoses are just seen individually by individual clinicians and physicians and educators, and nobody is like taking a step back. And for me, I think, because I see it all the time, it's very glaring to me, and I get frustrated because I can't understand how people may have missed something like this.
Right.
It's not uncommon, and you see that very frequently.
You're saying so many things that are like taking the step back, like, and maybe even not even treating it as a diagnosis at first, like just being able to take a step back and look at the whole person and what they need and how will that inform this process. And another piece of that you kind of, I was actually thinking about this last night as I was reviewing these slides, and you kind of hit that right on the head, Jill, is that there's not a lot of people who have that expertise like you do and like you guys do, that you know, so many medical doctors or like even therapists and mental health professionals who are being asked to diagnose people, like it's being missed. You're absolutely correct. That's what was going on with me. And while it was bad, it could have been far worse. Like you might have kids that end up committing suicide or attempting it at least. And that's terrible that we can't let that happen. So it's like, just like you guys have the MAST program to train first responders and police, like this is a big thing to think about, and you know, could lead to like a lot of other conversations. But how do we make sure that the hospitals and the mental health care places like truly know how to recognize that? Shouldn't they be, and I don't know how this process works, but shouldn't they be like saying like, okay, this person's showing some signs, I need to refer or like get some advice from somebody else and not try to just do this diagnosis on my own? I don't know enough about the process for how it works, but it's a lot of it's missed.
Yeah, and I think it's just people, in terms of clinicians, they are just stay in their lane, and they're just seeing it with blinders on, and it sometimes, it's unfortunately, is really being able to get to the right person that has the knowledge and the expertise to be able to look at it. And then I guess the only other comment, again, because I see it so frequently, especially like for kids that are like school age children. And it really, for me, I get very like, it's very frustrating for me. And I get very like overprotective, very protective of these kids, because what I hear is because they don't have like a good understanding of these kids and they don't have supports in place, they very much get labeled as rude, disrespectful, lazy,
and that makes the problem, that makes it so much worse.
And they get these horrible labels from teachers, from administrators, from other parents in the school building, and it really is because they have a disability that's gone unrecognized and they don't have appropriate supports in place. Yeah,
and you can see that right in my like that's a lot of what happened to me, and is why that goes on to snowball into that burnout, you know, that should be able to be prevented. So yeah, Jill, I would like to talk more on this at some point. I know it takes a lot of baby steps, but it's important that we do better for the next generation and don't have what's happened to me, and that so many people that probably had it worse yet than I did. So Drew.
There you go. So first off, again, as everybody else has said, thank you so much for sharing like your story and everything. It was very enlightening for me, because I feel like for me, actually, it would be more of like a what if kind of scenario, because I was actually diagnosed at 2.5 for autism. And so during my education process, I was given a lot of my like a certain therapist and everything. It all started in like first grade and everything. And similar to yours, I also had a very supportive mother, and so you know, she helped me every step of the way. And it was odd, because I feel like throughout the years, it's like I've had moments where I, you know, wasn't feeling that great. It probably could have been small burnouts, but it wasn't like a major one. But it's always interesting to discover other people's stories, and it also could have been related to like a different school too. Maybe this one was like or you know, maybe it had like a different support staff, or maybe it was something in the community. But No, this is very, very informational though. I love to hear different people's stories and their upbringing and everything. So
yeah, you know, it would be very interesting to do, Drew. I'm glad that you said that. I'm glad you spoke up about that, because it would be cool at some point. I don't know when or where, but to have a panel of us autistic speakers who can share like those differences in our life experience. Because we've had, Drew, we've had different conversations in my meetup group about like kind of the pros and cons of like, we hear a lot these days about the pros of early diagnosis, and there's plenty of them, I assure you, but there's also like there's pros and cons to each. So it is always interesting to hear those different perspectives. I think that would be great for more people to hear. Drew, thank you.
Absolutely, and I can understand that, yeah, the pros and cons of it, because at first I'm like, what's a con against early diagnosis, and I'm like, wait a minute, the social like aspect of it. So
well, and so like I think I've seen, and I'm glad that this didn't happen with you, but I see like some of the adults coming to our group whose parents have like maybe not, of course not intentionally, because every parent wants what's best for their child, but set kind of lower expectations for their child than they would have if they hadn't been diagnosed with autism. And so there's a lot of things that could be discussed about pros and cons of early. I mean, there are some ways in which believe it or not, after everything I've shared today, that I'm actually quite grateful that I wasn't diagnosed young. And there's days where I'm like, God, you know, like this thing never would have happened this way if I would have been diagnosed earlier. So, I mean, there's from my own experience, I can kind of think of the pros and cons. And Drew, it would be really interesting to get a group of us together, I think, to do a panel for people to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. If you need any of my contact information, or when you want to get this started, just let me know. I'm happy to join in and
well, I would love to have you involved. Yeah, for sure. That lived experience, coming back to the lived experiences, there's I know I like people to learn about autism, what it is and everything, but the lived experience is equally important, if not more important. So yeah, those opportunities for people to learn from our lived experience, I love being involved in those.
Well, this was great, Katie, and I do see we're 5 minutes over, so thank you everyone for staying on, and if you do have other meetings and commitments, thank you for joining us for our Lunch and Learn. I will, Katie, with your approval, be happy to send out the slides to the staff, and then the recording for those who weren't able to join us today, and again, that'll just stay internal. But if there are any follow-up questions to Katie, I know she's already put her email in the chat. She's pretty much an open book for any questions.
Yeah, you can reach out. You're welcome.
Appreciate you for that.
Yeah, welcome, Becca, and for the Navigator and all the stuff that that I'm working a lot with Upbound, and for Navigator, definitely reach out if you have. There's some stuff I'm working on for some of you right now. I mean, I'm always kind of looking at resources, but if there's something specific that you're getting phone calls about, yeah, just reach out and let me know. You can use my Autism Alliance email or the one I posted in the chat, always, or follow up on our conversation today. Always happy to hear from folks.
Thanks so much, Katie.
Thank you, Mark, for being here, and you're welcome. Yeah.
Thanks, Katie.
Bye, guys.